My name is Torbjörn Dodé, and I'm the head of the Stockholm China Center. And I wish you all most welcome to this webinar on China-US relations. It's my very great pleasure today to introduce our two speakers, Professors Judy Polumbaum and Mark Seidel. Judy is Professor Emerita of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Iowa. About 10 years ago, my wife and I were Judy's neighbors at the City University of Hong Kong, where she and I were both visiting scholars, and then we became very good friends. Mark is a new friend. Mark is a professor of law and public affairs at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I understand Mark is my new friend, but I understand that he and Judy are old friends. Both of them are old China hands. They have been engaged in China studies for almost 50 years, and they belong to the first scholars from the US who worked in China after the Cultural Revolution. I believe Judy helped start up the China Daily in the early 1980s. The China Daily was set up, I think, in 1981. And Mark served on the team that established the Ford Foundation office in Beijing, which we know has played a very important role in scholarly community, in different kinds of cross-cultural communication between China and the West. So Judy's and Mark's knowledge of China is based not only on reading and study, which they have certainly been engaged in, but probably at least as much it's based on personal experience. So it's a great pleasure and honor to have that you have both agreed to visit us today and to share your views with us on Sino-US, China-US relations. So without further ado, I will then give the word to you. The floor is yours. And we just before opening the webinar, we agreed that Judy will begin. So please, Judy.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. As was introduced, I am Emerita, which means I'm no longer actively involved in researching and writing about China. So I consider myself kind of a dilettante now, not really an old China hand, although the old is probably apropos. But I've always found it hard to keep up with events and the mood in China when you're not regularly visiting there. My last visit was at the end of 2018, and it actually was the first real vacation I ever took in China. It had nothing to do with research. It was just an exploration of hot springs in Yunnan province, so that was quite lovely. I do have a son who is working in Beijing. He's a jazz musician. So we might say he's a very good ambassador for American culture. There is a small but very vibrant jazz subculture in Beijing, a bigger, more activity in Shanghai. But I do keep up with him, and he keeps me somewhat apprised through video chats of sort of the mood in Beijing. And now, of course, it's pre-Olympics, and things always kind of come to a halt when big events happen in Beijing. Everyone else has to pause and stop and make way for it. And it's a very strange time for an Olympics, of course. But overall, I try to keep up with the state of US-China relations, mainly through reading now and commentaries and the comments of officials on both sides. And social media, of course, is full of things and increasingly unreliable. So I must admit, I'm increasingly confused about matters, all matters in the world, including US-China relations. But I kind of look for glimmers of hope because things are grim now. Mark and I have talked before about what we anticipated from the Biden administration, which basically has carried on with a lot of the rhetoric of the Trump years and some of the major policies, continuing with the tariffs, continuing with a very confrontational posture. Um, Although the rhetoric has been toned down a little bit, it's not as wacky as it was during the Trump era. It's still basically the same message that China is eating our lunch, and all kinds of problems in the world are due to China, and China wants to take over everything, and that China is our an economic competitor in every way. So what once seemed a policy of, at least attempts on both sides at true engagement, with many, many opportunities for what we once called people-to-people relationships, um, study exchanges, cultural exchanges, scientific exchanges, all that. Um, it's really slowed. It's really been interrupted. But at the same time, there still is talk of cooperation, collaboration on climate change. I think John Kerry is one of the few officials at the national level in the U.S. Um, who really genuinely is seeking engagement in that area. And late last year, the U.S. and China agreed to reaffirm their agreement to work to reduce carbon emissions. Although the details of that have yet to become clear, at least that is a hopeful sign. Evidently, there's continuing scientific collaboration in some areas. COVID, of course, has been a very dicey area with all kinds of conspiracy theories flying all over the place about origins in a Chinese lab, which don't seem likely, origins at a U.S. military base, which don't seem likely. So, true collaboration on solving the origins of COVID and the problems of COVID doesn't seem to have developed yet, but there apparently is very serious ongoing collaboration on cancer treatments and cancer trials, and so kind of a little bit under the very top surface, there are still meetings going on, still exchanges and programs and plans. So that also is perhaps a hopeful sign. I grasp for these hopeful signs because there are so many depressing signs. And of course, there are the human rights issues of the suppression of protests in Hong Kong, which is particularly dismaying, I think, to those of us who have spent time in Hong Kong, when it was a very vibrant place that really was a sphere of its own that had a great deal of autonomy, always with the prospect of Beijing setting the rules, but it's just very dismaying that these uprisings have been squashed and that laws have been changed, and the Xinjiang issues are very difficult to follow because it's such an opaque area. So the stories of human rights violations are kind of a mishmash of scholars who really know what they're talking about, scholars who have all kinds of other agendas, and posturing, and so I think progressive people who feel friendly toward China are caught in a difficult place. We don't have enough firsthand information, yet we cannot be apologists for China, of course, nor can we be apologists for the United States. But I guess with our experiences in China going back so far, we hope for some sane, sober reevaluation of the situation we're in. I mean, I get up every day and say, why do people throw around this rhetoric of confrontation, which isn't helpful to anybody, and it doesn't seem to have died down. It plays well to the American public. We're in a true China bashing era, and we've gone through these sorts of cycles before, but it's particularly dismaying to see after so much progress has been made in true normalization of kind of adult relations between the two nations. So I guess I would caution that I have absolutely no answers or even good explanations, except that perhaps, as always, a lot of American foreign policy is a result of domestic issues, and I look forward to your questions. I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Judy. I hope you can all hear me okay. First, on behalf of Judy and myself, our thanks to the Stockholm China Center, and please forgive my pronunciation. My pronunciation of Swedish is not very good, shall we say. Professor Loden and Anna Yarmuth for organizing this. And I see several other Swedish friends on the call today, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. I want to talk about three things, again, in about 10 minutes, as Judy did, and then we're going to open it up for questions and comments. I want to talk about the general scene in US-China relations, at least a bit, and then I want to focus in for a few minutes on two areas that I've followed particularly closely. One is the question of academic exchanges between China and the US, and the other is what you might call civil society exchanges, or the civil society relationship between China and the US. On the general side, I think it's possible now that in the close to 50 years that Judy and I have each been following US-China relations, we both went to China in the 1970s. I started going to China in 1972. Judy and I met, although our families knew each other. Judy and I met in Beijing in the late 1970s when we were both among the first wave of Americans to be working in China. Of course, the Swedes and others had long been working in China before that, but we met then. And in that 40, 50-year period, I think it's possible that we can say that at least in terms of the bilateral relationship between China and the US, this is the most consistent, coldest period in that 40 to 50 years. I was talking with colleagues recently about the period after Tiananmen, when Judy and I were both in China, and I was working in China, as Professor Loden mentioned, at the Ford Foundation in Beijing. And it became very quickly clear after June 1989 that there would be a reopening, that exchanges and programs would resume. That was made clear very quickly in the summer of 1989. we're now in our, depending on how you measure it, 10th or 11th year of increasingly cold relations between China and the United States. By some arguments, and I think I do subscribe to this, it's a far more serious situation in terms of the bilateral relationship than the period after Tiananmen, when it became clear that at some point relations were going to improve, and that in some aspects of the relationship, some form of normalized relations was going to reemerge. We really don't have that situation or that expectation today. Across the board, as Judy has indicated, the situation has been exceptionally difficult through one Chinese administration, the Xi Jinping administration, since 2012, and in different ways through now, if I'm measuring correctly, 3 different US administrations. The rhetoric is somewhat different, as Judy indicated, in the current Biden administration, but the fundamental dynamics of the very difficult bilateral relationship have not significantly changed since the end of the Trump administration. So this is the lowest ebb, this decade-long period, but increasingly so. This is the lowest ebb since 1989. It's hard to find a lot of, as Judy puts it, glimmers of hope in the situation. I should say that while there are those in the United States who would like to see some de-escalation in confrontation between China and the US, it is important to note that while these days they may need to be quiet, there are many in China who would like to see a de-escalation in conflict and confrontation between China and the US. No one is being unrealistic here. Everyone understands that with the growth in Chinese power and with the United States continuing to hold on to its power, or seeking to, that both countries will be engaged in conflict and confrontation across a great number of fronts going forward. But there are groups in both countries, and I merely wish to point out that there are many in China who are not happy about the current state of confrontation and would like to see some either amelioration of conflict, or at least a reduction in the rhetoric, so that we can cooperate on things that we can cooperate on, be in conflict on the many things in which China and the US are going to be in conflict on going forward, regardless of the administration in the US or regardless of the administration in China, and get on with engagement and trying to at least begin the process of working out some difficulties. So that's my sense of the general scene. If Judy and I are perhaps somewhat calm about this, I think it's because each of us have seen ups and downs in this relationship in the time that we've been involved with China, which is since the 1970s, as I said. That doesn't mean the situation is good, but we've seen ups and downs. But this is, as I said, for me, the most sustained cold period in the relations that I think I've experienced in my time working with China. Let me say a couple words about academic exchanges and about civil society work between China and the US. And then we're going to open it up for questions and comments, which I believe Professor Loden is going to moderate. Obviously, because of the twin reasons of the political relationship and the COVID situation, we've seen a dramatic reduction in academic exchanges between China and the US over the past several years. This gets expressed in terms of course, the tremendous reduction in the number of students and visiting scholars coming to the US. There are numbers on that for those who would like to look at that. And then more generally, because of both political reasons and COVID-related reasons, a real reduction in the opportunities for cooperation and engagement in academic exchange. The real question, it seems to me, going forward is differentiating COVID from the political ramifications, the political dynamics. Once we are, to some degree, liberated from the COVID problems, which is still going to take a while, we all know this, everyone on the call knows that. For me, the interesting question is going to be, are there ways of rebuilding academic exchanges and academic collaboration between the United States and China? This is not to say that everything has completely fallen apart. That is not the case. The issuance of visas for Chinese students and scholars has now reemerged, has now begun again. Chinese students and scholars, to some degree, are coming back to the US. The numbers are lower, of course, than they were in 2019 for a variety of reasons. And so once we get out from under the COVID scourge, the interesting question, at least to me, will be, is there a basis for going beyond Chinese students and scholars coming to the United States and a relatively small number of American students and scholars going back to China, to rebuilding some of the academic cooperation and engagement that we have had at various times with up and downs over the past 30 to 40 years. And given the politics of the situation, given the coldness in US-China relations, that's going to be a very, very hard task. There are some fields in which it may be easier than others. One might have thought, for example, in earlier periods of China-US relations, that STEM fields, science fields, engineering fields might be ways of rebuilding China-US academic engagement when the COVID situation eases, and if there's political will on both sides to go ahead with re-engagement in academic life. However, because of the significant problems involving the China Initiative in the Department of Justice and the investigations into scientists and faculty in the US, as well as suspicion in China of some Chinese who have been engaged in China-US academic cooperation, it is no longer as easy to see STEM, science, engineering, mathematics, etc., leading the way, which we might have seen in earlier periods of coldness in China-US relations. So some of this, it's very hard to know now because COVID is depressing everything, but some of this may need to be field by field and rebuilding carefully. Some of this happened in 1989, 1990. I happen to be lucky enough, as Torbjörn mentioned, to be working at Ford in Beijing at that time. And we both watched and participated in the reinvigoration of China-US academic exchanges after Tiananmen. That's without forgetting Tiananmen. That's with Tiananmen very much firmly in mind on both sides. But there were ways of trying to rebuild, and rebuilding took time, and rebuilding took different paths in different fields. We may see something like that once COVID is lifted as a key barrier for academic exchanges, but it's not going to be easy. Civil society is a little bit different. I'm just going to say a few more minutes on this, and then we're going to open it up. Civil society is a bit different because fairly quietly, a significant range of civil society engagements between the two countries, especially US organizations, as well as European and other organizations in China, have continued during this difficult time. They have continued under significant constraints in China. Most of you are familiar with the newer constraints in China through the overseas NGO law, which limit the range of activities that a wide variety of overseas NGOs, foundations, think tanks, and business associations can engage in China, and have employed a new licensing process in which the public security officials in China are the leading force in determining what foreign NGOs, foundations, think tanks, business associations can do in China. So even under these significant constraints since 2016, a certain range of relatively uncontroversial, service-oriented activities in the civil society realm have been able to continue between the United States and China, particularly with US organizations working in China. I have to stress that is considerably more constrained than it was 10 or 15 years ago. We go through ups and downs in terms of civil society relations, foundation grant making, think tank activity between China and the US. And this is clearly a down time, a constrained time in terms of activities. But some things have continued, and they have often continued in a relatively quiet way because of challenges to them both in the United States and in China. Here, again, once the COVID lens, once the COVID barrier becomes less of an issue, one of the questions is going to be, to what degree is it possible to expand the basis for civil society engagement between China and the US? Are we ever going to return to a situation in which US foundations can go beyond service provision in terms of their grant making in China? Are we ever going to go beyond a situation in which European, other Asian, US, and other NGOs can work on advocacy matters as well as service matters in China? That's very hard to know at this point, but we are in the, by some measures, and I've written a lot about this, the 10th or 11th year of increasingly strict constraints in terms of civil society engagement between China and the US. And it's not so easy to see those constraints loosening very quickly anytime soon. This leaves some United States-based civil society organizations, again, non-governmental organizations, foundations, think tanks, and business associations, but primarily the first three, NGOs, foundations, and think tanks, with some choices to make in the coming years in China. Once COVID becomes less of an issue, and the political constraints to some degree remain in terms of very strictly limiting what American, European, and other groups can do in China, at that point, the question may come to face some overseas groups as to how long it makes sense to remain working in China under conditions in which activities, grant-making programs are really quite severely constrained, especially under the overseas NGO law framework. Some of those questions have been put off during COVID, but it will be very interesting to see over the next, say, 3 or 4 years, because it's going to take a long time to get out from under COVID. It'll be very interesting to see what some of the NGOs, foundations, and think tanks decide to do under situations of highly constrained activity in China. So that's some general comments. It's some comments on the academic exchange situation, which is in a very difficult situation. It's some comments on the civil society situation in which some activities have continued, but under, as I said, highly constrained frameworks. And with those initial comments, I'm going to stop and turn it back over to Professor Loden. And Judy and I welcome your questions. All difficult questions will go to Judy, and I will take the easy ones. That is our division of labor in these talks that we do together. Anyway, thank you all very much for listening, and hello to friends on the call, including, I won't call her out, an old friend whom I first met in Beijing when I arrived to live there in the summer of 1979. She knows who she is and she's on the call. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both of you, for these interesting introductions. Of course, you raise several issues that are very much worth discussing, and some of them are also very difficult. I also welcome everybody at this stage to raise questions. But before, maybe I could allow myself to use the privilege of being the moderator to raise one very general question. I think everybody, certainly both of you, and I'm sure the attendees also agree with us, that during the past decade, we have witnessed China becoming increasingly authoritarian. It has changed a great deal. Of course, there are people who say that China, the People's Republic of China, has always been very authoritarian. Those changes have only been a matter of degree. But my distinct impression is that China was really becoming very open, and that the situation was very promising especially perhaps in the 1980s, before 1989, but also in the post-89 era. For instance, when Judy and I first came to Hong Kong, I think there was great promise. But since during the past decade, China has become more and more authoritarian. During the same time, during the same period of time, democracy in other parts of the world, in America, or in the US at least, and in Europe, has suffered serious setbacks. And many of us feel that the basic features of democracy as we have known it now for a century, perhaps, are really threatened. So I wonder if you would care to say something about this impossible question. What kind of linkages, what kind of connections do you see between these two processes? That is, mainland China becoming increasingly authoritarian, and democracy and openness, pluralism being increasingly threatened and questioned in say, Europe and the United States, but also other parts of the world.
As I said, the difficult questions go to Judy first.
Yes, well, that is a fascinating, intriguing question. To what extent are the kind of dissolution of what we think of as democratic processes and tendencies, in such vastly different systems in different parts of the world, to what extent are they connected? And as I said, I have no answers, but it seems to me that the economies of both countries are absolutely intertwined with the politics and political climate of both countries. And in a very strange way, the Chinese system, which is this, state-supported and managed capitalism, you might say now, is much better poised to weather difficulties, to, decree remedies than the United States, where the system is so dysfunctional that even trying to put through a package of infrastructure remedies is impossible. The system is in such gridlock. And so, in this very weird way, I look at China with some admiration. We look at the COVID situation. Absolute, government controls and mandates will not work in the United States because the anarchic citizenry will not stand for it. In China, China is accused of having draconian COVID restrictions, and people are much safer, and the level of infection and death is much lower. And our younger son is an emergency doctor. The emergency rooms are in gridlock. I mean, some days he actually gets off work early because he can't do any work, because there are hours-long backlogs in seeing patients in the it's absolute insanity. And so, you look at the difficulties in both countries and the very different ways of dealing with challenges, and you think, well, is there a happy medium? There doesn't seem to be a happy medium because we're at such extremes. And so, I really don't know. It may just be, is this, the historians of the future will talk about the global meltdown of democracies many, many decades hence, if the planet is still around. But I really don't know. It's a puzzle to me. Are these connected, and if so, how are they connected? Mark, I'd certainly be interested in your
Yes,
thoughts.
Mark, what do you say?
Thank you, Torbjörn. Thank you, Judy. First is to recognize I think the correctness of what you're raising, which is the rise of even more authoritarianism in China. I want to be careful how I say that, because China was authoritarian before 2012 as well. And the decline of democracy and pluralism in the United States and in other countries. That phenomenon is correct. There's a widespread debate going on about to what degree those things are linked. There's no doubt that it has given China some force of argument. I don't have to agree with this, but some force of argument in effect saying primarily to its own citizens, but also internationally, that given the decline in processes, the gridlock, the dysfunction that Judy talks about, and in some cases, not all, more efficient functioning of some aspects of the Chinese bureaucracy, that the West should no longer serve as any kind of model for the intellectuals and others in China who might have thought at one time that there were those eating in China. Showing here that my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully you can. The rising authoritarianism in places like China, Vietnam, and other countries, and the decline of democratic and pluralism processes in the United States and parts of Europe and other places. I think it's also useful to say that while there are many problems in the United States and Europe, there is still some room for citizens' movements to try to rebuild democracy and pluralist processes in parts in the United States and parts of Europe. There is, to some degree, an openness to contention in democratic and pluralist terms, which means that there is resistance to Trumpism in the United States and to Orban and others in Europe. Increasingly, that's not the case in China, and I have to say that. It's very difficult for intellectuals who would like to see a different path being taken in China, or others, students, workers, and others, to go beyond a very limited contention over working hours, over salaries, things like that, to raise more fundamental questions in China about the directions of China. That is to say that while there are tremendous problems with democracy and pluralism in the United States and in parts of Europe and other places around the world, I wouldn't want to draw an equivalency with the situation in China. The opportunities for contention, for discussion of futures in China are just much less than in some other places around the world. I'm not coming at this from a right-wing American perspective on American democracy. Judy and I and others here have watched in horror the Trump years in the United States and watched with hope as we try to rebuild democracy and pluralism in the US. But the situation in China is somewhat different, and we shouldn't in any way draw any equivalency between them. You know, I'm not sure I can say much more than this about that, except that I think that there are well-minded people, I'm thinking of Chinese colleagues and friends in China and in the United States that would like to try to work through the tremendous problems domestically in both countries and begin to at least have some productive dialogue and engagement. Whether that will be possible in the years ahead, again, once the COVID scourge is lifted, is very much up in the air, very dicey. But at least that's the hope from some well-minded people on both sides. Let me stop there and turn it back over.
Thank you very much. And let me just very briefly say then that it was certainly not my intention to say that the situation in terms of openness and democracy in China and in Europe and the US is equivalent. I very much agree. I think what Mark said here is extremely important. May I also make a comment about our technical problems? The connection is not perfect, but I forgot at the outset to mention that Judy is now in Iowa and Mark is in New York City. So it's still rather remarkable, isn't it, that we can conduct this conversation at all. Now we have a number of questions, and I will read out the first one here. From Salvatore Alaimo. Will China's tremendous economic influence continue to be the glue of this relationship? Or will a decoupling process begin, driven by philosophical and political differences? I'm noticing more products made in India, Pakistan, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Kenya. Would they like to take that question?
Well, I think all of us probably are noticing this shift of manufacturing and this in the search for cheap labor, where capitalism has a relentless prowl around the world. There have been China is for a long, considerable period was the sort of manufacturing base. There was a saying, China makes, the world takes. It used to be Detroit makes, the world takes. But now I think the growing interest on the part of American business is in the Chinese market as the middle class grows and purchasing power grows. And American business is eager to, establish a balance of trade where we're selling as much as we're buying. But clearly, business is still going. Underneath all this, the U.S. is buying stuff from China, selling stuff to China, and in the view of some people, and I think there's something to this, the sort of pragmatic interests of the business world are likely to be an extremely important factor in any stabilization of relationships. That pragmatic interests, more so than ideological interests, have been a governing factor for decades now. China apparently just signed some huge contracts for U.S. companies' provision of liquid natural gas over the coming decades. And so the economic relationships are inextricable and will continue, I think, to be very important. And this may be a time when they, become more constructive forces than the ideological polarities that are tearing us apart.
Thank you. Questions are coming in, so I think perhaps I should speed up a little. I think I'll read two questions to you now. First, from an anonymous attendee. Does any of you think the COVID pandemic has benefited the US and China relations, either politically, economically, militarily, and or other relations aspects? First question. Second, from Deborah Davis. What would you think of focusing on creating opportunities for Chinese to work with NGOs and CEOs in the US?
Why don't you take those on?
Sounds good. First, a quick word about Professor Alaimo's question. The first question, Professor Alaimo is one of the leaders in the excellent philanthropy and civil society program at Grand Valley State University in Michigan, which has been hard hit by COVID, by the economic situation, and by the decline in China-US relations. And I need to agree with, in effect, both sides of what Sal is asking. The China-US economic ties will continue to be the key glue in the relationship. And yes, at the same time, we are seeing diversification on both sides of the China-US relationship. We are seeing attempts to diversify production and supply chains over the last year or two. Of course, some of this had begun before that, but we're seeing more of that diversification from the US. At the same time in China, we are seeing a diversification, not just in terms of exports in the economic arena, but in terms of China's work in a variety of fields, whether it's sending students and scholars abroad, whether it's civil society engagement that goes beyond the links with Europe and the US that were the key pillars of civil society engagement for China over many years and have now expanded throughout the world. So I think that the economic ties are the glue in the relationship. And yes, to answer Professor Alarmo's question, I think we're seeing attempts at diversification on both sides. We'll have to see how fast that goes. On the second question, do you think the COVID pandemic has benefited the US and China relations? In the sense that it has, in effect, frozen most things, including travel between the United States and China, which has been very difficult, as all of you know, and it's the same with Europe, I know. In terms of programming, it's been very difficult during COVID. And to some degree, the freeze that has been imposed by COVID has masked the fact that it may be very difficult to rebuild the diversity and the richness of China-US relations in a variety of fields once COVID is over. That doesn't sound like it's a benefit, but in terms of giving both sides more time to think about what a revitalization of China-US relations might look at, a period of time, several years, in which it's almost impossible to do very much, which is the situation in academic exchanges and to some degree in civil society work. Having a couple of years of sort of a frozen period may not be the worst situation right now. But eventually the reckoning is going to come. And when we are finally out from under some of the COVID restrictions, then we're going to face the question, as is going to occur in Europe-China relations, certainly in US-China relations, what is possible given the situation in China and given the situation in our countries. Finally, Professor Deborah Davis from Yale, also an eminent scholar, asks, what do we think about focusing on creating opportunities for Chinese to work with NGOs and CEOs in the US? I think that's a very useful thing to do. I think it has been tried at various points. The degree to which that is possible to operationalize in China depends to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree on constraints in China. One of the problems here for that kind of programming in the United States right now has to do with the willingness of if we're thinking possibly of civil society organizations, NGOs, foundations, think tanks, and the others, the willingness of those groups in the US to proactively engage with China at this time and say over the next 3 to 5 years. There has been an increasing unwillingness to proactively engage with China on the part of a range of American civil society organizations. They look at Xinjiang, they look at other aspects of authoritarianism in China, and they don't see, as they might have seen 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they don't see a compelling argument for special engagement with China. And overcoming that is going to be a very difficult set of issues in the US. And I have to say, as someone who, like Judy, has engaged with China from the US for now 50 years, as of 2022, I'm not unsympathetic with that view. It's very hard to make the argument in the civil society community in the US as to why there should be special engagement with China, even if that's funded by foundations and others. So while I think programmatically that's a valuable thing to do, And I think there are young Chinese civil society activists, managers, and others who would love to spend some time in the US with American NGOs, foundations, and other groups here. I think making the case for that on the US side is considerably more difficult than it would have been 10 years ago. And with that, I will turn it over for comments and corrections to Judy.
No, I think we can leave it at that and maybe address some of the other questions.
Are you sure? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, then I will read a question by, I'm sorry that I don't know these participants. It means probably that I'm getting old. Pierre Landry, if that is a French person, writes as follows: are Xinjiang and the Taiwan questions insurmountable obstacles to a resumption of more normal US-China relations post-COVID? Who would like to begin?
Well, I'm not an expert on either Taiwan issues or Xinjiang issues, but if we go back to the Nixon visit, of course, Taiwan at that point was dealt with in a rather innovative way, and with an acknowledgement in the Shanghai communique, as Professor Landry well knows, that Taiwan is a part of China. And basically nothing further was done nor said, and the U.S. continued with its, as a patron of Taiwan, but we managed to come a long way. So I don't see that China has any interest in military action in Taiwan, even though it's periodically threatened. I can't conceive of that, although a lot of things have happened in the world that I thought I couldn't conceive of. So I really don't know. Taiwan, when it's convenient to make Taiwan a flashpoint for either China or the US, it becomes one. Xinjiang is a very, very difficult question. And of course, the challenges of Xinjiang are, the most difficult for China itself, when this is a vast area with important resources, and it's now, as I understand it, half Han. I mean, the population is no longer simply a minority ethnic population. It has been largely integrated into the Chinese economy, and yet, there are certain imperatives of a traditional culture and religion and so forth that China has not figured out how to deal with in a humane manner. And we go back and forth on human rights. To what extent should sectors of the economy be squeezed because of the Xinjiang situation? To what extent does that simply further harm Xinjiang? To what extent does sanctions against individual Chinese officials help or harm things? I don't know. It's a very, very dicey, delicate balancing act, and it seems that for the time being, both Xinjiang and Taiwan are important factors in the relationship, and whether they have to be or not, I suppose that there could come a time when they are not as important. But at the present time, they certainly are overriding factors.
And to mark on this important question.
It's clear that both Xinjiang and Taiwan are very significant obstacles to a resumption of more normal China-US relations, as Professor Landry, a social scientist with great experience in China and Vietnam, knows very well that they're very significant obstacles. But we are seeing, I think, a more professionalized, in some ways, approach to some of these problems in the US, in the Biden administration than in the Trump administration, which is not to say a softer approach, but an approach which attempts to, under very difficult conditions, not just on the US side, but also to some degree on the Chinese side, begin the process of talking about issues that the two sides can talk about. As Judy indicated before, climate change is one example of that. Not that it's going to be easy, it's going to be very difficult, but at least there is some attempt over the past year to begin the resumption of dialogue on some issues that can be discussed without necessarily Xinjiang and the Taiwan question eliminating the possibility of all dialogue, sometimes because of problems in the White House under the Trump administration, and sometimes because of problems in China. Having said that, Xinjiang and Taiwan are very important obstacles and will continue to be very important obstacles. And if there are continued negative developments in Xinjiang, or if the Taiwan situation becomes much more serious, much more quickly, then we could at some point be using the term insurmountable. I probably wouldn't use that term today because I do think that both sides are making attempts to talk about things to some degree separately, occasionally. And I think that's a good thing to do. But those are big problems, there's no doubt.
Thank you. And now a question from a Swedish colleague, Mr. Mats Engman, who is a Swedish general who works for the ISDP now, and he's my colleague. Mats writes as follows. Of course, there are several reasons for the current situation. One seems to be the lack of rule of law, transparency and openness in many issues from the CCP leadership. They say one thing and do another, which always raises concerns. Do you notice any signs of a positive change concerning this? Thank you. Who would like to begin?
Well, I think as Mark said, there were many signs of positive changes, greater transparency, rule of law, and so forth for several decades, and now things have retrenched. And yes, they say one thing and do another. I think all governments do that. They say one thing and do another. Right now, I mean, the hope, of course, is always in those people in China who want reforms. I think in many ways, China has, as severe cross currents of polarization as we have in the United States. On very in very different situations, of course, but I don't see any signs of increasing transparency and pluralism and democracy and so forth in China. I really don't. But again, I'm quite removed from the situation. So. If there are signs, maybe Mark will tell us.
What do you say, Mark?
I think, thank you, Professor Engman, for the question, which I think is an important question. Look, I think as we go into, I guess we would call it the 10th or 11th year of the current administration in China, I think the trends that we have been seeing since 2012 are not reducing, are not ameliorating. I'm not sure everyone would characterize those exactly in the same words that you're characterizing them in, but assuming the rough accuracy of the statements there, I don't think we're seeing any change right now. for me at least, one of the more disturbing aspects of this, at least in China, and I don't want to only talk about China because I think there are problems with the rule of law in the United States as well. But I think one of the more disturbing aspects of this in China is the reduction in internal debate, the reduction in the inability for intellectuals and others to engage in even careful contestation of party and state policies. There is a real concern and fear on the part of many intellectuals and others in China, and I'm not just talking about dissidents, that they just cannot contribute to policy development, to policy advocacy in ways that were possible perhaps as late as 2012, 2013, 2014. And that worries me as much as the situations that you're talking about. So I don't immediately see signs of a positive change, as you put it. But look, in around 2015, 2016, maybe 2014, there was a theory, if you will. The theory was that once Xi Jinping really got control, that looking back on the history of him and the current administration, the theory was they will let things relax a bit. Some on the call may remember that there was extensive discussion of this in China and to some degree among those who are concerned with China around the world. Call it 5 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. Certainly that occurred in the fields in which I look at, which are primarily these days civil society, nonprofits, state-society relations, things like that. There is very little discussion like that these days, that once the current administration has really gotten control, things may then loosen. It's been a while since we've heard about that. Signs of a positive change in terms of what you're talking about, I, quite frankly, right now, don't see much to indicate that.
Thank you. May I perhaps add a brief comment here? If we think back a couple of decades, I think really most pundits, most observers that I know about, as far as the Western world was concerned, they felt that now democracy has finally triumphed. We even know that the phrase "the end of history" became a catchword. And with regard to China, I would also believe that very many people, many leading experts, were also convinced that in spite of China being still authoritarian, China was on the right track. And then there has been disillusionment. And it really began, I suppose, with 1989. And if pre-1989 and fall of the Great Wall in Berlin was the end of history, after that, and especially since Xi Jinping's ascent to power, it seems to me that many scholars and experts reason as if we have now reached the end of history. It's noisy somewhere. Yes. I think I hear Chinese in the background, but I hope they are not interfering with us. No. Anna, is there anything we can do you think?
I don't know. Judy, do you have something?
Can you mute them, Anna? Well, anyway, thanks a lot. And anyway, during the when this optimism gave way to pessimism, Scholarly theories were developed. We learned that the Chinese system is resilient in a very special way. And I think this evokes very old images of China. Really nothing new. But what I would just like to say simply is that I don't think that we have seen the end of things. I think that we can understand why China is now becoming so authoritarian. And while I agree with what Mark said a few minutes ago, that there is very little room, very little space for questioning and criticism in China today, appallingly, frighteningly limited scope. Still, we know, those of us who communicate with Chinese colleagues and friends, we know that there is widespread dissatisfaction, at least among colleagues in China. And I'm absolutely convinced that today's truths will be questioned. I think that many of the basic arguments underlying the idea of the importance of engagement, they are still valid. I mean, today, President Clinton's ideas about what engagement would lead to is, at least in this part of the world, often ridiculed as just stupid. I think in a longer perspective, this idea of the significance of engagement and of cross-cultural communication is still very valid. That was the end of my sermon now, and I will read another question from Nijat Turgun. Thanks for your explanation. And I just wonder how scholars in Chinese studies could help politicians and businessmen to understand better the implications of a rising China.
Well, this assumes that scholars in Chinese studies have something useful to say to politicians and business people in terms of the implications of a rising China. I say that cynically, but I actually do think that scholars in Chinese studies and scholars in European studies and American studies in China have something to say to help politicians and business people to understand the implications of a rising China on this side and the implications of what's happening in Europe, Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world in China. But finding the paths to those kinds of influence, to those kinds of conversations is very difficult. Both in China and the United States, academics more intensively, I think over the last 10 or 15 years, are trying to find ways to bring what they know to broader communities. We call that public engagement. We call it the process of public intellectuals. There's lots of things that it gets called in the United States or Europe or other places. But I think the attempt is there, both in China and the US, to bring what some people know to a broader implication or broader influence. But it's very difficult in both countries. And sometimes we have, as academics, very real limitations in terms of our understanding of the dynamics, whether it's China-US relations, Europe-China relations, et cetera. And sometimes our colleagues in China who would like to be an ameliorating influence or would like to have some influence on policy are constrained not just by limitations on their role, but by their own knowledge as well. So I think it's a very difficult process. In the US, we do see some academics at times having roles on the National Security Council and in other parts of Washington where they can bring some of their experience to bear. We see that, for example, to some degree under the Biden administration, more than under the Trump administration. And I think we've seen some examples of that in China as well. It may not be exactly the kinds of intellectuals and academics that some of you or some of us might like to see having influence, but that's not our choice. That's the Chinese choice. But I think it's a very difficult process, and the academics wind up talking more to each other than to policymakers or business people.
Would you like to add something, Judy?
You're muted.
Muted.
I'm sorry. I think politicians and business people have, their own worlds, and when they wish to consult academic specialists, they certainly do, but it's very hard to impose learning upon them. Of course, they politicians and business people have very different constituencies from academics. Um, we have students and colleagues in classrooms, and can go on at great length about subtleties of ideas, and politicians want broad brush statements, simplifications. So I absolutely agree with Mark. It's essential, but it's very, very difficult.
Okay, let us take a couple of more questions. Now we have many questions, and also we will soon be running out of time, I'm afraid. A question by Rokas Damoulis. China started helping educational institutions to open Chinese culture, language programs, facilities, and putting Chinese government chosen teachers to run the programs in the schools, and putting those teachers on the school boards. China has been using this to increase its influence. Do you believe that having closer educational ties and student exchanges is good if China uses every possibility to increase its influence? And let me take the second question also by Börje Jungen, who I understand is an old friend of Mark's. The world is small. We are witnessing a global power shift as China is rising. Such shifts are by definition difficult to manage, not least for a challenged power. Can it be managed? Best Börje. Who would like to start?
I'll first address the second question, the rising power. Of course, the rising of another power is most difficult for the existing power to face. And if you go further down in the question from Mark Selden, he references the National Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy, which I think is it's a wonderful, wonderful group that was formed in large part to address this very question, the shift in global power relations in the world, and how does the world go through such a shift without military confrontation? Essentially, the worst possibilities that you want to avoid: military confrontation and ecological catastrophe. Those are two areas in which the U.S. and China could partner and say, regardless of how this all shakes out, we are going to prevent military confrontation and ecological catastrophe. And clearly, we need to cooperate there. So best case is, despite all the other differences and causes for competition, that ultimately we see the virtues of collaborating on those existential matters. As for the establishment of educational institutions and China's influence, I think many countries do this. They extend a helping hand and hope to ingratiate themselves at the same time. The whole soft power push. And I think if accepted and handled well, such institutional channels don't need to become primarily propaganda channels. The University of Iowa has had a Confucius Institute for a long time that the university supported and then finally withdrew support for because it had to make a lot of hard choices, and that was an relatively easy choice. But that institute was devoted to language teaching. It wasn't particularly a promoter of China and Chineseness and Chinese propaganda. It was a wonderful infusion of resources for language teaching. And so I think, all these channels can be productive in many ways, can be channels of cultural exchange. They don't have to be pernicious channels of influence. It all depends on how they are handled, in part by the recipients, how the recipients handle them, but how these things are negotiated. I think they can be very positive.
Would you care to add some comments, Mark?
So on the second question that Rukas Demoulis asks, do you believe, and I'm going to intentionally misstate this question, do you believe that having closer educational ties and student exchanges is good if the United States uses every possible possibility to increase its influence? That's the question that's going to be asked in China. That's the question that has been asked in China at various points over the last 40 years. And I think that the answer in China is similar, in my view, to the answer in the US, which is that closer educational ties and student exchanges are a good thing. Each country is going to try to increase its influence. That's what countries do. But in the broader question that Rukas Demoulis asks, and I do want to switch that around so that it's clear that China asked the same question as the United States or Europe asks, I think closer educational ties and student exchanges is good. In the more limited question, the first question, which is really a Confucius Institute and related programs question, we are already seeing the priority on Confucius Institute programming in China beginning to fade. That went through a period of years in which Confucius Institutes and other such programs were developed in China and made available in the United States and other parts of the world. There's then been pushback to that, and so that is already fading. China is using that to increase its influence, just as US government program activities in China have been used to increase US government influence. I would only point out that in the highly stratified and highly unequal systems of higher education in the US, where we need Chinese language training, at Princeton, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and some other schools are not going to go away because Confucius Institutes go away. And of course, Madison never had a Confucius Institute. But there are campuses around the United States where there is just not sufficient state and federal resources for Chinese language and other language education. And if it is impossible to use foreign aid for those purposes, those programs may just go away. And students who should have an opportunity to learn something more about China and to learn Chinese language and to get ready to go to China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or other parts of the world may not have the ability to do that. I'm not arguing for a resurgence of Confucius Institutes, but I do want to point out the stratification and inequality in American higher education, which means that if foreign aid is unavailable, then the elite campuses, including Iowa and Wisconsin, are going to be able to continue their Chinese language programs, but others are not. To Ambassador Lundgren's, the distinguished Ambassador Lundgren's broader question. Global power shift, China's rising. These shifts are by definition difficult to manage. Ambassador Lundgren is being understated, as always. Very difficult to manage, not least for a challenged power, by which he means the United States. Can it be managed? That's the broad question which animates everything we are talking about today, because that's what's going on fundamentally in terms of what he refers to as the global power shift. The United States is seeking to cope with that rise of China across a number of different fronts. It's very difficult to manage. It's particularly difficult to manage under COVID conditions, but it's not necessarily bad that we've had a freeze where everyone can think about what they'd like to happen next once the freeze is lifted. But managing that power shift is very, very difficult. And again, to transition to the eminent Mark Selden's question a lot has to occur in the areas in which contributions and progress are possible and dialogue is possible. It's easy to say that it's impossible to manage that, which is not what Ambassador Lundgren is saying. But it's easy for others to say that it's impossible to manage that. At least under more rational administrations in the US, I think there's some hopeful recognition that by trying to deal with some issues, we don't have to deal with all issues under one rubric, which is the rubric of constant attacks and bad relations on both sides. Let me stop there.
Thank you. And I'll read Mark Selden, Selden's remark. Mark Selden, renowned China scholar. It's good to see you here. Nice to see Judy and Mark in action. You both provide a cautious approach to restarting the engines of a wide range of proactive relationships, rightly noting difficulties on both sides. True, of course, but shouldn't our starting point be this? The future of the world system, starting with world peace at a time when the deepening Taiwan and South China Sea and other conflicts pose high risk of war. And doesn't serious attention to climate crisis and COVID crisis require US-China international cooperation? In other words, we need to start from the necessity for overcoming obstacles while recognizing the difficulties. This is our approach at the National Committee for a Sane US-China Policy, Mark Selden. And we heard both Judy and Mark refer to this initiative earlier. Would you like to add a comment now, either of you?
I think Mark Selden has said it.
I would just underscore that, I absolutely agree that that the basis of the relationship ought to be addressing and cooperation in addressing those huge existential issues.
Okay, then I'll read a few questions because we are really running out of time now. Deborah Davis again, I don't mean recruiting in China. Dilshad Ahmed, is China take our USA in Wells to be next superpower? Let me see now.
And then a question from Bruce Rabb at the bottom.
I'm sorry that I'm now losing.
I'll read Bruce's question.
Yeah, please, Mark, good.
Bruce Rabb is also an eminent human rights activist and lawyer in New York. What do we know about the birth rate situation in China? To what extent is it a problem, and how do you expect it to affect policy? We are clearly seeing declining birth rates in China. There's been a number of articles about this in the Chinese press and in the Western press in both Europe and the US. A significant piece about this, I believe it was in the New York Times yesterday. But the harder question is, how do we expect declining birth rates in China to affect policy, the demographic problems or the demographic crisis in China? How would that affect the bilateral relationship or the European-China relationship? And quite frankly, that's very difficult for me to assess, and it's something I really haven't even thought about. To my friend and colleague, Bruce Rabb, I'm going to have to, in the American sports analogy, football, punt on the Judy Polumbaum of the Los Angeles Raiders, in case she has any thoughts about that.
Well, I also am not a demography expert, but clearly China is concerned about labor supply, and support for aging generations, and we too face some of those issues, and so it's going to figure into everything, but I have no idea how. I really
I know that our friend Börje has actually done quite a lot of work on this demographic question recently, but I'm afraid you cannot join us live, Börje. If you would care to briefly write some words of wisdom, you are welcome to, but we are also running out of time. I look at the clock and I can see that we are now approaching 4:30, so I think it is time to wind up. May I ask in conclusion if you would like to make some concluding remarks? We can go on a few minutes after 4:30 here in Stockholm. Mark, would you like to say something in conclusion?
So thanks to all of you for the terrific comments and questions. It's hard to summarize an hour and a half like this, but clearly the situation in terms of the bilateral relationship between China and the US remains a very difficult situation. At the same time, as Judy says, there are glimmers of hope, and one of those glimmers is the recognition which Judy has mentioned and which Mark Selden mentions in the comments, the chat feature, that we do need to try to focus on the areas in which there is some possibility for dialogue. As Mark says, we need to start from the necessity for overcoming obstacles while recognizing the difficulties. I think there is some recognition of that in the new administration in the US. I think there's some recognition of that, at least among some forces in China, including some forces in China that may sometimes talk very hard about the United States in terms of Taiwan or the South China Sea. So I do think that needs to be the approach, as Judy said at the beginning and as Mark mentioned in the comments. And I think we've tried to identify some areas in which that might be possible over the next several years, in effect, to try to set the stage for dialogue on issues we can discuss so that when the COVID freeze is lifted, there's some possibility for some ongoing activities. Judy, over to you.
Well, I would just second all that, and again, thank you for this opportunity, and I'm heartened at the tremendous interest in these issues. So
Thank
thanks.
you. Two brief comments. First of all, coming back to demography, it strikes me that the China Center, that the ISDP, just published digitally a book, an anthology of conference papers called Politics in East Asia. And two of the papers there, one by Joseph Yushek Chung in Hong Kong and one by Börje Ljunggren, both address this question of democracy, I seem to remember. So please have a look at that if you are interested. You can read it on our homepage, on our website. Secondly, just a personal comment that I think it's very important that we don't give up hope that dialogue can overcome obstacles. There is no, I cannot see that there is any alternative to trying to maintain dialogue and contact, while also being honest and speaking our mind. We should not voluntarily place ourselves in a situation where we are the ones who shut doors. With these words, I would again, especially like to thank Judy Polumbaum and Mark Seidel for being with us during this 1.5 hours. I think it has been tremendously stimulating. It's certainly impossible to summarize or conclude this, but it's been very stimulating. And I think the topic that you discussed today is exceedingly important, and at least I have benefited a lot. I'm also very grateful that so many people joined us today. I think it's been an unusually lively and nice afternoon for us here in Stockholm. For Judy, it's still very early. It's soon time to have breakfast, Judy, I guess, in Iowa. Again, thank you so much to the two of you, and thank you to all our attendees, and thank you to Anna and my colleagues at the Stockholm China Center for cooperating in organizing this event. Thank you and goodbye. Hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.